Welcome to the Why Factor, a chance to work out why we do what we do. BBC World Service podcasts are supported by advertising.
Thank you for downloading from the BBC. For details of our complete range of podcasts and our terms of use, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.
Ciercis canadensis,
White ash,
Cornus cusa,
tree of heaven.
BBC World Service. This is Helena Merriman with the Y Factor.
Pyrus salicifolia,
Maple,
Sambucus,
Chinese pine tree, bamboo.
This week, extreme control, natural highs, swimming mice, false imprisonment, and a blade of grass on no man's land. Why do we garden?
Jin 太原中，武陵人捕鱼为业，缘溪行。
This is Professor Ji Hu. He's the director of the Landscape Design Department at Tsinghua University in Beijing. He's reading what could be described as one of the founding myths of gardens. It's a Chinese fable called Peach Blossom Spring, and it tells of a fisherman who discovers a secret garden. There are ponds, mulberry trees, bamboo, and the air is thick with blossom.
Tao Yuanming was a Chinese poet, and his life in Jin Dynasty is more than 1,600 years ago. And that time, the social life was not very stable. And he retired from the politician's position. And he hated the struggle between people and the politicians. He imagined there's a wonderful life outside the society, and he wrote Peach Blossom Spring. He described a utopian society without a politician, but in a beautiful countryside with trees and gardens and flowers.
In the story, the fisherman stays in the secret garden for a week. When he leaves, he promises the villagers not to tell anyone about it. Of course, he doesn't keep his promise, but no one ever finds the secret garden again.
So this idea became a model or prototype for scholars to build their own garden for hundreds of years.
And so began the Chinese tradition of scholar gardens, an art form described by some as the mother of all gardens. Plants, walls and water features were combined, not for function, but to invoke legends, fantasy and surprise. The Chinese phrase for Peach Blossom Spring has now come to mean utopia. And now, in every corner of the world, there are mini-utopias, tended by obsessive gardeners.
How many kinds of sweet flowers grow in an English country garden?
We're standing underneath one of my favourite shrubs. This is called a Ciercis canadensis. They're tiny little purpley, heart-shaped leaves, and they're absolutely gorgeous.
Daffodil, heartsease and phlox, meadowsweet and lady smocks, gentian, lupin and tall hollyhocks, roses, fox.
So I'm Winkle Howth, and I'm a really keen and dedicated gardener of some 36 or more years. It's an urban garden. It's in a conservation area of South London. I'm a fairly hyper person, quite frantic really, and I find that it calms me down. It has a tremendous calming effect. It's the sheer peace I find when I'm actually in the garden. I hate wearing gardening gloves, which is probably why my hands always look terrible, and I usually have scratches up my arms. I like to get my hands into the soil. I feel the plants only want to know my hands, and I only want to know them when I've got the true feel of them and not behind gloves.
Soil. Talk to any gardener and soon you'll get onto the subject of soil. Whether it's silty, sandy or chalky, most like to get their hands covered in it. So what is it about gardeners and their soil? Could there be more to this relationship than meets the eye?
Mycobacterium vaccae is a bacterium that's found in the soil and also mud and water sources.
This is Christopher Lowry. He's an associate professor at the University of Colorado at the Center for Neuroscience. He's been trying to find out whether a bacterium called Mycobacterium vaccae, which is found in leafy, peaty soil, might have any effect on our serotonin levels. Or, to put it more simply, does soil make us happy? He conducted an experiment injecting the bacteria into mice.
Rodents like mice and rats are very good swimmers, and it was found many years ago that if you treat animals with antidepressant drugs and then put the animals in just a beaker of water, it would cause the animals to swim for longer periods of time.
So, after injecting the mice with the bacterium, Dr. Lowry placed them in a cup of water to see what effect it would have on their swimming.
These mice that had been injected with the bacterium swam during a 6-minute test for a longer period of time than animals that just got a placebo. That was very exciting for us.
In other words, this bacterium had a similar effect on the mice as an antidepressant such as Prozac might. And when we plant or dig in the soil, we ingest this serotonin-boosting bacteria through our lungs or cuts in the skin.
Most people that are in gardens will realize when they go back in the house and have to spit or something, there's lots of dirt lining the mucosal layers of the respiratory tract. And if you're in an environment like that, then certainly your exposure to these types of bacteria is going to be much higher.
So it seems we get a natural high from soil. But the highs of gardening can be more indirect too, especially for those who don't have their own private garden, but create public gardens for the masses.
I read a book from the American landscape architect Frederick Olmsted.
This is landscape architect Ji Hu again, talking about the moment when, as a teenager, he found his calling.
When he designed New York Central Park, he wrote about his feeling to bring a public park not for rich people but for everybody. And his words influenced me a lot. So I make a decision as a landscape architect, I would do many parks for the citizen to enjoy their life in the new cities in China.
In China's overcrowded cities, few have their own private garden. Over the past 10 years, Ji Hu has designed 58 public gardens all over the country. The largest, in Beijing, gets up to 100,000 visitors in a single day. Ji Hu himself is often one of them, not so much for the plants, but because his pleasure derives from watching others enjoy his creation.
One day, I saw a very old lady sitting in a wheelchair. When she saw a flower next to the sidewalk, she stopped and held a small camera in her hand, but her hand was shaking. And for 5 to 10 minutes, she was trying to focus. When I saw her taking a picture with this shaking hand, I almost cried.
Most people around the world now have access to gardens, whether it's their own or a public one. But in life's darker corners, in prison or in war, many people don't. And some will go to extraordinary lengths to create one.
This research began with a single photograph.
This is Kenneth Helfand, Professor of Landscape Architecture at the University of Oregon, and the author of Defiant Gardens, a book about gardens made in war, including flower gardens behind the trenches in the First World War, and vegetable gardens made by Jews in the ghettos in the 1940s.
The motivation behind it was in a way similar to the way that philosophers have looked at people in the most extreme circumstance, that perhaps that tells us something about the essence of the human condition, that if I looked at gardens in the most extreme circumstance, and war is certainly the most extreme of circumstance, it might tell me something about the meaning of gardens to people. The single photograph was an old stereo photograph, and it described gardens behind the lines that was in the French trenches in the First World War. It shows a group of soldiers by their dugouts with their rifles, living essentially as troglodytes in this horrific mud environment just adjacent to no man's land. And behind that were these small little vegetable gardens. The nature of the First World War was that the trenches were stabilized for long periods so people could have a garden. And soldiers created these. They would write home for seeds and garden manuals. And I read descriptions of individuals looking out towards no man's land and seeing and being inspired by a single blade of grass. This is a German soldier. His name is Lothar Dietz. He was a philosophy student from Leipzig. He was killed near Ypres in 1915. And this was from a letter that he wrote. As one can't possibly feel happy in a place where all nature has been devastated, we have done all our best to improve things. From a pine wood close by,
which had been destroyed by the shells, we dragged all the best treetops and stuck them upright in the ground. Out of the gardens of the ruined chateau of Hollebecke, we fetched rhododendrons, box, snowdrops and primroses, and made quite nice little flower beds. We have planted whole bushes of willow and hazel with pretty catkins on them, and little firs with their roots, so that a melancholy desert is transformed into an idyllic grove.
The main reason for these was not food. These soldiers had adequate food. It was the act of gardening, the act of doing something that had a connection to their home environment, and something that was alive. Because on the other side of no man's land, or no man's land itself, was this terrain of death, this horrific environment where nothing lived.
It's not just in war that gardening becomes such a powerful, humanizing force. There are newer forms of no man's land too.
My name is Sabin Willett. I'm a lawyer in Boston, and our law firm started going down to Guantanamo Bay in 2005. We were working for a number of prisoners who the government had determined were not the enemy, but they could find no place to send them. And one of these was a fellow called Sadiq. Sadiq was a bear of a man. He was very broad-chested. He had long, curly, thick hair, big beard. He looked like a pro wrestler. He'd been imprisoned in Afghanistan and was liberated, so to speak, by the Americans, who then swiftly sent him to Guantanamo. He was very quickly cleared, but there he was stuck in Guantanamo, and we took on his case. And he used to say, "Can you try to get some gardening magazines?" Because he liked to see the pictures of flowers. It was early in 2006. I had come down to see him, and one of the things I was telling him was that we had, made these requests for a garden, and we didn't seem to be getting anywhere. And that's when Sadiq said to me, "We have a garden." And I said something like, "So that's wonderful, they've given you tools." And he shook his head. He said, no, they haven't given us any tools. So I said, "Well, how do you dig?" I'd seen the soil. I'd crunched my boots across this flinty, barren soil. How could you have a garden if you didn't have tools? And he said, "Spoons and a mop handle." Now, I should point out the spoons were plastic. This was puzzling to me, and I said, "You couldn't possibly dig with these spoons." And he explained that they had this little plot of earth outside their hut, and at night they would pour water on it, and then they'd pound it with the mop handle. And then in the day, they would start scratching at the pounded soil with these spoons. And then I said, but did they give you seeds? Because it was hard for me to imagine the military cooperating. Now, Sadiq almost never smiled, but when I asked him that question, he did smile a little bit. I think his eyes twinkled, and he said, well, sometimes with the food, they give us a tomato or a bit of watermelon, a lemon. We save the seeds. I thought it was the most marvelous thing that you could be in such a soul-crushing place, and there was still this human instinct to try to create something, to try to create life.
For some, when facing death or imprisonment, a garden represents life. But the peculiar magic of gardening doesn't seem to come from just looking at plants, flowers or shrubs. The magic is held somewhere in the act of gardening, in planting a seed and watching it grow, perhaps for a rather prosaic reason: control.
They're not going to speak to you, they're not going to answer back. They might, turn up their heels and keel over. But for the most part, we can control, what we do with that plant. It is an area of one's life that one can have quite a lot of control over and have the effect from it that you desire.
You have a control over something, or a limited control over something, because you can't control the forces of nature, but you can watch it, monitor it, and it gives a sense of satisfaction.
I was reminded of the poet Gerard Manley Hopkins. There's this passage or this line that goes something like, there lives the dearest freshness deep down things. And I remember thinking of that deep down things, deep down a fellow like Sadiq, there was still this primal urge to create something for life, to grow something. And I thought that was very powerful.
Erisamum bulls,
Chinese pine tree,
Eucharis,
bamboo,
Clematis
poplar
viticella,
tree, willow tree,
Hydrangea
elm
arborescens,
tree,
Annabelle,
Chinese scarlet
Salvia
tree,
caradon.
white ash, tree of heaven.
There are dozens of different podcasts now available from the BBC, including news, documentaries, science, business, arts and sport. For details of them all, go to bbcworldservice.com/podcasts.